I've been debating with myself for a while now whether or not I should post this. It happened when I was young, but I've never told anyone about it because I thought they would think I was crazy. But it just happened again. When I was a sophomore in high school, my best friend's mother, we will refer to her as Jane, passed away in a really bizarre accident. I remember when we received the news like it happened an hour ago. It was especially memorable because it happened to be the first time ever that my friend, we will call him Jones, ever decided to skip class with me. Jones and I weren't really troublemakers. If anything, we were both considered the nerdy kids, even though Jones was kinda dumb and I only really looked like a nerd. I didn't even play video games back in those days, unless it was multiplayer. But you get the idea. We were nerds, a couple of goody two-shoes. We went to this red brick school in the south, keeping it vague, that was kind of run down and relatively small. Every day, halfway through the day, we had a block class, where we sat and worked on homework from other classes, or asked the teacher for help with things we generally didn't understand. Sometimes we watched the news, but that was pretty rare. Every other Friday, usually. Jones and I had planned to sneak away during block class one Friday, while our teacher decided to play the news for us. We were pretty determined, so it was relatively easy. I asked to use the restroom, and Jones told me later, when we met up, that he snuck out after the lights were off. The goal of the day? To try and explore any potentially creepy areas the school might be hiding behind closed doors. I had a hall pass, so I was good. I played lookout, peeking around corners to make sure that Jones wouldn't get caught if the hall monitor was out there. Eventually, we made our way downstairs and into the basement. We knew it would be unlocked because 2 weeks prior, another kid got detention for breaking the lock to see what was down there and bragged about it. Only, apparently, the lock had been fixed. Jones was really nervous about breaking it with me, but I convinced him to do it anyway. What's the worst that could happen? Some schools were getting cameras installed around this time, but ours wasn't one of them. The budget for this school was pretty sad. Nobody was around, and if we were caught downstairs, maybe we would get away with lying, telling them we found the lock that way. Of course, I realized that never would have worked now, but I was a young, dumb kid. Anyway, Jones and I made our way down there, and it was sufficiently creepy. What was really odd, though, was that the light switch didn't work. Luckily, my digital watch had the little button you could press, and the face would light up green. So we continued, hardly able to see. It was starting to get a little hot down there, and Jones started to complain, saying that the heat was making him itch. I told him to stop being a crybaby, and he went completely silent. I continued on, not realizing that he had stopped following me for at least a good 60 seconds. I called for him, but he didn't answer. I was getting creeped out now, but brushed it off as him probably pouting. Whatever, I told him. Be that way, crybaby. My voice was a little shaky when I said it, but I was determined to not look scared, so I went on without him until I found a door. Next to the door there was a stack of blank copy paper. I don't know why I remember that so vividly, but it drew my attention somehow. Maybe I thought I saw something else. I opened the door, which was pretty warm, and discovered the boiler room. It was oddly hot in there, since the boiler was no longer being used at this time. Our school had just made the switch to a furnace. Besides the boiler, there wasn't much to look at, but my kid brain still enjoyed how creepy it was. Besides the boiler, there wasn't much to look at, but my kid brain still enjoyed how creepy it was. Just some old tools, and a rusty cabinet and a small sink, a couple of stools and folded chairs, a spray bottle. There was a lot of dust and spider webs which made it even more interesting for my kid brain. And then I heard crying. Was it Jones? I called out his name, but he didn't answer. Then I heard a crash that scared me out of my wits. I swear I piddled a little and slammed my hip into the cabinet, then quickly dashed underneath it to hide. If it was a teacher, I really didn't want attention because my dad would beat my ass. And if it wasn't a teacher, well, that might be worse. I hid for a few minutes. The sobbing sound eventually returned while I was under there. Someone had to be down there with me. If it was Jones, why wasn't he answering? He couldn't have been that mad at me. We were always calling each other names. I was down there for what felt like forever. Jones never came back, but the crying never stopped. Finally, I got up to leave. Just as I was about to shut the door to the boiler room, I heard a female voice that sent shivers down my spine, and a horrible, icy feeling in my gut. "What are you doing down here, young man?" Came the hiss of a woman who sounded uncannily like Jane, Jones's mother. At the time, though, I thought maybe it could be a teacher, so I dashed out of there as fast as I could, hoping to avoid my face being seen. I tripped and scraped my knee, hit the light on my watch as fast as I could, and went to rush out of the basement before tripping right over Jones, who cried out in fear and pain, which scared me again. Once I calmed down, I realized that Jones was crying. He blamed it on me tripping over him, but his face was kind of red, and looking back on it, I think he had been crying before that. Was he the crying voice I'd been hearing? He must have been. And the female voice? Definitely had to have been a teacher. We only had one janitor, and he was a male. Mystery solved. I felt much better. All the creepiness was in my head. Or so I thought. Jones said he was done, and that he just wanted to go back to class. Just as we agreed, the bell for next period sounded, causing us both to jump. Clearly he was as jumpy as I was. But I still had a hall pass I needed to return, and even though he was probably going to get in trouble, he agreed to walk back with me, since we were both shaken up, I assume. So we get back to the block class, and Mrs. Bell is standing there, waiting for us, but she doesn't look angry, just very concerned, and her eyes are fixed on Jones, who is looking increasingly nervous by the second. We exchange a look before approaching her, and she approaches us as well, dropping to her knees and dramatically taking Jones's hand in hers. I remember her exact words. "Honey," she said to Jones, "I'm afraid I have to send you home for the day. Your father is waiting in the principal's office to come and collect you," she told him, giving his hands a squeeze before standing back up. "If you need to talk, I'm always here, sweetheart," she told Jones, who gave me another nervous look before taking off. I handed Mrs. Bell the hall pass, and she took it without a word. Collecting my books, I moved on to the next class, feeling somewhat ill for the rest of the school day, which I brushed off as anxiety, wondering what Jones and Mrs. Bell's exchange could have been about. As soon as I got home that day, I called Jones on his family landline. His father answered, telling me that Jones wouldn't be in school for a couple of weeks. His mother had passed away that day, around the same time we were skipping class. He didn't tell me much, other than that she had died the day before, and was understandably off the phone pretty quick. A few weeks passed and Jones was back in class. He found me first thing when he was back, and told me what happened. Apparently, Jane had gone for a long drive, following an argument that she'd had with Jones's father, saying she was going out to buy some cigarettes. When she returned, Jane was crying inconsolably, and somehow managed to damage the locking mechanism in the car. It was a really, really hot summer day, one of the hottest on record back then. So, with all her inconsolable crying and heavy breathing, and the sun beating through the windows, she died of a heat stroke. After telling me this, he hardly spoke to me from then on. He was like a changed person. He began dressing in black and hanging out with the goth kids. We still talked occasionally, but drifted apart a bit over the high school years. I always wondered why the hell his father thought it was a good idea to tell him what happened. I also always thought the story was pretty weird, but never pried. Like, why didn't his father break the window or something? It just sounded so odd. Did her car not have working AC? Fast forward to grad night. Jones and I hook up momentarily, wanting to stay in contact, despite drifting apart. So we exchanged information and went our separate ways. I never forgot about this weird situation though. Fast forward even further. I'm 30 years old now. This is what made me want to post about it. I haven't spoken to Jones in a year or two, but we've kept in contact, and I still have his information. I have a boyfriend. Yes, I'm gay. And he and I got into a serious, verbal fight one morning before I left for work. I'm embarrassed to admit that it left me in tears, and I decided to call in sick for the day and take a detour instead to sort out my thoughts. I went to buy myself a pack of Marlboro Reds. They've always been my favourite. Had myself a smoke, then drove to the park. It was a weekday, and our town is relatively small, so I happened to be alone at the park that day. It was raining pretty hard, but as I smoked my cigarette, my window was cracked. I started to feel really hot. Was I getting sick or something? I tried to open the car door to get out and breathe, but the door wasn't opening for some reason. It couldn't have been the locks because they were working just fine, but I could not get that fucking door open. Even though the window was cracked, I kinda started to panic a little and called my boyfriend on the cell. I told him what was going on, and he told me he was going to get an Uber to come over to me and break me out. I started looking through the glove box, not really certain what I expected to find, but was hoping to find something to smash the windows with. I wasn't even thinking at the time about how oddly parallel this story seemed to be running to Jane's. Someone tapped on the window, scaring the shit out of me. When I looked, I did a double take. It was Jane, and she looked completely fine, albeit a little older. What the fuck? My jaw literally dropped, and she laughed at me, motioning to roll the window all the way. So I did. Weird, because the window hadn't worked just moments before. I waited for her to speak. "Boy, I'm surprised to see you here. What are you doing all the way out in this neck of the woods?" She asked, as though nothing were out of place but me. I didn't even know what to say. I just kind of stuttered gibberish until she spoke again. She said my name. "It's been nice catching up, Shane," she told me, then walked away as though nothing had happened. When my boyfriend showed up, he just pulled the handle and it opened. He thought I was losing it because of that, which discouraged me from telling him what happened. I did not imagine that. I wasn't drunk. I wasn't drugged. She was there. Definitely. First, I googled her. Nothing beyond her obituary. Then, after a long debate with myself, I called my friend, and was met with a slew of curses and fuck yous in response to the story. Jones didn't believe me at all. He called me an arsehole, and told me he would be changing his number. I didn't call him back because I felt really bad. What the fuck did I just experience? I only have two theories of my own. The first is that maybe Jane was trying to disappear for some reason, and her husband helped her to do it. And the other theory is paranormal, so I'm kinda leaning towards the first, as I've never believed in the paranormal. But even with the first theory, there are still things I don't feel are explainable by that. Hello, sinister listeners. If you've enjoyed this story, then you'll find all the author's information in the description below. For more content, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to succumb to the sinister.